In the year 1066, an invasion took place along the coast of France in Normandy that altered the course of history. Nearly 900 years later, in 1944, another invasion came to the shores of Normandy that once again changed the world. And during the 11th century, not far from the coast of Normandy, in the tiny village of Canisy, there was a fortress, a castle built by a member of the Carbonel family, who fought beside William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and 30 years later in the First Crusade.
Seigneur de Carbonel, that was his name, was already the owner of the Chateau de Canisy at that time, and it is as such that he participated to the conquest of England. So, in any case, whatever is the right interpretation, the family was here in Canisy, in its chateau, in the 11th century.
Few archives remain from the Middle Ages and the days of the medieval fortification at Canisy. But the original North Tower still survives, along with its adjoining curtain wall. Now, almost 10 centuries later, the castle has evolved from a defensive stronghold to an elegant chateau, which has remarkably remained in the same family throughout the ages. Count Denis de Kergolay traces his namesakes to the late 18th century, preceded by 2 generations of the Faudois family, and before that, nearly 700 years of lineage through the Carbonels.
I come also from the Carbonel family, and this family was an important military family in Normandy. There are lots of battles in which some of my ancestors participated, and they were possessing many other properties all over Normandy, and not only the Chateau de Canisy.
The Chateau of Canisy survives as a window on the past that beckons as a gateway to the future. This, then, is the story of the Normandy region of France and the Chateau of Canisy, whose corridors have marked the advance of time for almost 1,000 years. Normandy is a region of lush farmland and rural countryside in northwestern France, where 360 miles of dramatic coastline sweep along the shores of the English Channel. It is a gentle, peaceful land full of pastures and forests, rolling terrain and grazing cows, villages of stone houses and half-timbered cottages, colorful flower boxes and tranquil streams. A place that has inspired poets and artists with its ever-changing light. Yet despite its placid charms and serenity, Normandy has a tumultuous history, frequently filled with conflict. More than 350 years before the Norman conquest of 1066, the Archangel Michael appeared in a dream to the Bishop of Avranches and commanded him to build a chapel on the summit of Mont Saint-Michel. By the year 710, a shrine had been established, and later, when the Pope donated some relics to the site, the chapel of Mont Saint-Michel quickly became a pilgrimage destination. Benedictine monks first inhabited the rock in 966, but the order grew rapidly, and soon the buildings could no longer accommodate their increasing population. Within the next 100 years, not far from Mont Saint-Michel, storm clouds of conflict were gathering to the northeast, heralding a series of events that would define the course of history in the 11th century. Canisy was still little more than unspoiled meadows and woodlands, but a castle was being built that would become the foundation of a chateau that has been occupied by the same family for 1,000 years. In 1035, William came to power at the age of 7. He was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Normandy and a tanner's daughter named Arlette. As an adult, William the Bastard, as he was called, unified Normandy, and his cousin Edward the Confessor, King of England, promised that upon his death the English throne would pass to William. But when Edward died in January of 1066, neither the English nobility nor the Saxon people were inclined to relinquish power to William, choosing instead to crown Harold Godwinson as their monarch. Harold's kingdom was immediately challenged, including a claim by William. By autumn, Harold was at war in the north of England, near York, while William prepared to invade from across the English Channel. Though victorious, Harold's battle-weary army was quickly forced to the south to combat William, who had crossed the Channel without opposition. On October 14th, after fierce fighting at Hastings, William emerged triumphant and advanced to London, where he became King of England on Christmas Day in 1066. William the Bastard had become William the Conqueror.
The Normans significantly changed. First of all, the ruling aristocracy of England. They simply replaced it as Norman lords, barons, established themselves in England with large estates, with castles, and with people, dependents of theirs, who were warriors, who fought in their armies. So there clearly is a kind of a change.
Feudalism was a system that was introduced into England in 1066 that provided kings with royal armies and provided their vassals with titles and landed holdings that established the systematic and legal aristocratic elites that govern the rest of society.
The Norman conquest ended England's age-old ties to Scandinavia and brought the country closer to Western Europe. Out of gratitude to the monks at Mont Saint-Michel for their support in 1066, William provided funds to build the first abbey. Construction continued well into the 13th century, and Mont Saint-Michel survives today as one of the architectural wonders of the world. A decade after the triumph at Hastings, it is believed that the Bishop of Bayeux, William's half-brother, commissioned an embroidery detailing the story of the Norman conquest for the opening of the Bayeux Cathedral in 1077. Approximately 230 feet long and roughly 3 feet high, with 58 scenes briefly captioned in Latin, the Bayeux Tapestry depicts the Battle of Hastings and life in the 11th century from the Norman perspective. Some experts think that the tapestry was designed to be interpreted by a storyteller who would move from scene to scene.
The storyteller, according to this theory, would have used the Latin inscriptions as prompts, and also as things to point to. The Latin inscriptions generally say, here. They always say, hic. Here's something. And then you have what's there.
In one scene, Harold is depicted at Mont Saint-Michel as saving 2 soldiers from the treacherous quicksand in the tidal flats surrounding the abbey. There is even a reference to Halley's Comet, which may have been considered an omen when it appeared in 1066. But for many historians, the tapestry is difficult to decipher.
There are figures in the margins. There are animals in the margins, which clearly relate in some way to the main story about how William of Normandy became King of England. But the way in which they do so is difficult to decode.
There is no doubt, however, that the Bayeux Tapestry serves as a priceless guidebook to the Middle Ages, a time capsule into life as it was a millennium ago. With feudalism firmly established, a document known as the Domesday Book was begun in 1086, just 1 year before William's death.
It was really the first systematic census of all of the lands that belonged to the crown in England, and William, being a new king in England, wanted to have a record of the extent of his lands, which nobles had administration over them, how wealthy they were, who owed him military service. And in the process, it established a wonderful historical source. We know much more about landholding, property owning and wealth and standard of living in England as a result of Domesday Book than we had of any other medieval source.
The Domesday Book has become a window into life as it existed during the Middle Ages. For nearly 400 years after the death of William the Conqueror, the story of Normandy, France, and England was an ongoing struggle for power. While much of the history about the castle at Canisy during that era remains dormant, it is known that the Carbonell family inhabited the property continuously throughout the periodic upheavals of the next 4 centuries.
One point of connection, I think, can be established between the castle of Canisy and things we've been discussing in relationship to the Norman conquest and the Bayeux Tapestry. It has to do with the centrality of castles, Norman-style castles, to political life in Normandy, in Western France, and in England. Norman-style castles are built throughout England, with the result that the castle, really, in England, in Europe, is a kind of unifying theme around which you can organize a discussion of many different facets of European life, and also the life of the aristocracy of France and of other regions as well.
One of the most influential figures between 1066 and the 100 Years' War was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who represented much of the quest for power in medieval France and England. Married first to Louis VII of France and later to Henry II of England, Eleanor had 2 sons who assumed the throne of England, though she herself was French.
First of all, she brought with her, as part of her dowry, the Duchy of Aquitaine, a huge territory in the southwest of France, which meant that a large geographic domain of French-speaking people owed their allegiance not to the King of France, Louis VII, but to the King of England, Henry II. And it meant English influence in the southwest of France, and it was partly over that legacy that the 100 Years' War later on would be disputed. But Eleanor's own position at court was very, very striking. Henry II, as King of England, still spoke French as his native language. Eleanor of Aquitaine was French. There was a very strong French influence, obviously.
In 1189, Eleanor's son Richard succeeded Henry II as King of England and Duke of Normandy. Richard spent much of his time fighting in the Crusades, establishing a powerful military image in the process, and earning the title of Richard the Lionheart. His fortress, situated high above the River Seine, was intended to protect the city of Rouen from French invasion. But Richard was killed in 1199. Within 5 years, King Philippe Auguste of France had annexed Normandy to his realm.
In 1204, Normandy really becomes a part of France, or the French try to make it really part of the French kingdom in a way that it never really had been before. And this is really the work of Philip Augustus, who was successful partly in undermining support of English kings in Normandy and elsewhere.
By the middle of the 14th century, the struggle between France and England for the powerful French throne had declined into the 100 Years' War.
In France, unlike many other states in Europe, the crown could not pass to a woman and could not pass through a female line. When the last king of France died without any male heirs prior to the 100 Years' War, the next closest male survivor, a nephew, was in fact King of England. But French law disputed that succession because it passed through the female line, the sister of the French king. And the Parliament of Paris, the highest law court in France, declared that the English claim to the French throne was null and void. And in effect, when an English king led an army across the Channel to make good on that claim, this is really what initiated the Hundred Years' War.
Between 1337 and 1453, the territory of Normandy was coveted by both France and England. But if political unrest was not enough, the Black Death came to the region in 1348.
First of all, it meant, for all practical purposes, the decline of feudalism and manorialism. That is, serfs who were tied to the land, their labor was now in great demand. They could demand wages. If you were fortunate enough to survive the Black Death, if you were a peasant, times were very good. It was just the opposite. If you were a landlord, a landowner, a noble, your land was only worth something if you had labor to work on it. And with a much smaller labor force, and that force now demanding wages, it meant a decline in the economic fortunes of the aristocracy and nobility.
Power and control of Normandy continued to fluctuate, and the combination of warfare and disease reduced the region to the throes of poverty and despair. Over the next 9 decades, periodic battles between France and England raged until 1429, when a teenage girl named Joan of Arc claimed to have visions that she was to lead a divine mission to drive the English out of France. At the age of 17, with the blessing of the French Dauphin Charles, Joan mobilized the French army to a stunning victory over the English near Orléans. And soon afterward, Charles VII was crowned at Reims.
While most historians are pretty certain she didn't don armor and get up on a horse and physically lead the troops to relieve the siege of Orléans, she clearly was present in the royal camp, and the French did in fact win. And many of the French did, in fact, give Joan of Arc's presence there the overwhelming reason and justification for their victory.
Joan's triumph, however, was short-lived. In 1430, she was captured by the Burgundians and sold to their allies, the English. In Rouen, the English put Joan on trial for a number of charges, the most serious of which was heresy, for claiming to communicate directly with God. Her clerical accusers were also shocked by her refusal to wear women's clothing.
This was a serious transgression of norms, and really even of rules at a time when dress is very strictly regulated. And for a woman to dress as a man was almost blasphemous.
In 1431, at the age of 19, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake.
Her martyrdom, because she did become a martyr immediately after her execution in 1431, did wonders for French morale, and everybody rallied around the Dauphin. And Charles VII had much more and stronger support as a result of Joan's martyrdom and execution. Had the English been smart, they would have just kept her in prison and wouldn't have executed her.
Another 22 years would pass before the English were driven completely out of the territory of France. And in western and northern France, only Mont Saint-Michel could claim to have never been occupied by the English during the 100 Years' War. From the 14th century until the first quarter of the 16th century, a period of remarkable artistic, architectural, scientific, cultural, and intellectual achievement became the catalyst for the transition from the Middle Ages to modern times. The movement had begun in Italy and was now spreading throughout Europe. It was called the Renaissance. The Chateau of Canisy was undergoing a renaissance of its own, with massive renovations in 1588 that would convert the ancient fortification into a spectacular residence.
And then here, in that wing that was built by Hervé de Carbonel, you obviously see the influence of La Renaissance that was coming from Italy. The purpose is no longer for military defense. The purpose is to show that you have a beautiful chateau that expresses your social status.
The renovations were undertaken by François Gabriel, an ancestor of the illustrious family of royal architects who would later design Versailles.
Their common ancestor started with the Chateau de Canisy, so we are very proud of this, of course.
Among Gabriel's recommendations was the use of the magnificent natural stone of the region.
You may see, when you see the architecture of Canisy, when you see around the doors and the windows, that pink stone that looks like granite, but is not granite. The name of it is poudinge, and I think that it comes from the word of pudding. And probably it shows that it's an agglomeration of different stones. And this pink stone is very specific of Normandy. I think it exists only here.
Gabriel utilized the violet stone with amethyst highlights to create the door and window frames, thus giving the chateau a unique dimension of color and relief. Along the northeastern coast of Normandy, where the mouth of the River Seine spills into an inlet of the English Channel, the tiny seaport community of Honfleur began to thrive in the 17th century. Honfleur was a haven for fishermen and pirates, but it was also a place from which many explorers sailed in search of the riches in the New World. A few were extremely successful, such as Samuel de Champlain, who founded what is now Quebec City, and Cavalier de La Salle, who reached the mouth of the Mississippi River, naming his discovery Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV of France. Trade routes with the West Indies, the Azores, and colonies along the west coast of Africa made the 17th and 18th centuries a time of prosperity for Honfleur. At Canisy, the 700-year succession of the Carbonel name changed in the early part of the 18th century when the inheritance passed through the female line to the Faudois family for 2 generations. The Faudois became Kergolais in 1787 when Louis Gabriel de Kergolais, an officer in the King's army, married Justine de Faudois, a wedding attended by King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, among other noted aristocrats.
Nobles were still very much thought of as warriors, soldiers, those who fight to protect the king. But that also meant they had influence.
Once again, the specter of unrest loomed throughout France. Anticipating a revolt, the family sent the young Kergolais couple to Italy in 1789. The timing could not have been better, for the winds of the French Revolution were blowing with increasing intensity.
French monarchs collaborated with the aristocracy. They used their influence on their own estates to further royal ends. And by making them their clients, by making it in the aristocrats' interest to support the crown, they were able to go a long way. And ultimately, at the time of the French Revolution, the aristocrats were about all the support the crown had left.
It would be 14 years before the Kergolais could return to the chateau at Canisy, thus escaping the fate of the Marquis de Faudois, his sister and his youngest daughter Eleanor, who went to the guillotine in July of 1794. Letters of the time revealed that Eleanor de Faudois was a close friend of Charlotte Corday, who, in July of 1793, assassinated the revolutionary leader Jean-Paul Marat by stabbing him with a table knife as he soaked in a medicinal bath.
She is a well-known figure because of this notorious act she committed, but it initiated a year-long reign of terror.
4 days after killing Marat, Charlotte Corday went to the guillotine. Within a year, her friend Eleanor de Faudois and her family were also beheaded.
A well-trained executioner could behead someone with one chop, but the archives are all too full of accounts of executioners who needed 2 or 3 attempts to complete an execution. So The guillotine was supposed to be a humane way to execute people, yet it became a symbol of butchery and violence, in fact, a symbol of inhumanity. That year-long moment from July 1793 to July 1794, where terror reigned throughout Paris. And the irony is, its inventor was inventing this as a humane weapon of execution that became a symbol of inhumanity.
Most of the castles during the French Revolution were confiscated and sold as property of the state. It was only the resourcefulness of Canisy's caretaker that saved the chateau during the Kergolet's absence from the property. According to written accounts, when officials arrived to take possession of the chateau, the caretaker shrewdly befriended them, got them drunk with Calvados, reminded them they had no authority since the owners had left France before the Revolution, and sent them back to Saint-Lô, 5 miles away. Louis-Gabriel de Kergolet finally returned to his beloved chateau, devoting the remainder of his life to transforming the grounds into an English-style garden. He introduced sweeping lawns, as well as a botanical collection. And the rectangular pool was enlarged to create a small lake with an irregular shoreline of carefully landscaped banks. In April of 1831, an aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville, a cousin of the Kergolets, traveled to the United States to study the American people and their institutions. By January of 1835, Tocqueville had published part 1 of 2 volumes entitled Democracy in America.
He argued essentially that success of a democratic state depended on a number of things, but above all on the mores, civil and religious, of the people. He was a firm believer of separation in church and state, but he believed that it was the religious commitment Americans had, and the freedom of religion, really, that enabled democracy to survive.
At the end of 1835, Tocqueville's cousin, Louis de Kergolet, would journey from Canisy to Paris to participate as a witness in Tocqueville's wedding.
And so those 3 cousins grew up together in Paris and in Normandy, knew each other very well. And 2 of them became the best friends in the world. It was Louis de Kergolet and Alexis de Tocqueville. All their lives, they have written to each other. And fortunately, most of the letters have been found in one of the family chateaus in the 1950s. And now they have been published. And they are very interesting letters because all their life, Alexis de Tocqueville was testing his ideas with Louis de Kergolet, who was a good sparring partner and was responding to him.
Today, Tocqueville's work is frequently quoted by journalists and politicians, and his ideas often provide a lively source of debate at universities throughout the United States. From the last quarter of the 19th century through the first quarter of the 20th century, another important movement found its roots in Normandy. This time, however, the revolution came from the world of art, where Claude Monet and others perfected a style of painting known throughout the world. His 1874 painting, titled Impression Sunrise, gave the movement its name, Impressionism. During his early years, Monet was greatly influenced by Eugene Boudin and Johann Jonkind, who introduced him to the pleasures of painting in the open air, directly from nature. Another major impact upon Monet and other Impressionists was the richness and texture of Normandy's ever-changing colors and patterns of ethereal light.
In all of Normandy, the light is extremely soft. So everything's soft-edged, which of course fits right in with Impressionist painting, which is all soft-edged. And Monet loved it because he said nature never stops.
Artists from all over the world are still captivated by Honfleur's picturesque setting, where inspiration thrives beneath a canopy of alternating sunshine and shadow. In 1883, while standing in the doorway of a train as it passed through the village of Vernon, Monet discovered Giverny. and it was there that he would live until his death in 1926.
Interestingly enough, there were American Impressionists who had found Givigny even before Monet moved here, which is not that well known a fact.
Though Monet is best known for his paintings, his life extended far beyond the world of Impressionist art.
He had another life. He was a famous botanist and horticulturalist. He used to, he was an absolute world expert, and he used to exchange bulbs with, his friends who were the royalty in Japan and all over the world. And he kept a ledger about all the things, that he discovered and knew about floral plants growing and all that. And he, these gardens are about 3.5 acres, and every month the format changes. And he had color schemes for each format.
Eventually, Monet arranged his studios to allow him to paint his gardens regardless of the frequent changes in the weather. Across the street from the house is the water garden and the famed water lilies. At first, Monet had no thought of painting them. Then, suddenly, as he once stated, the magical world of my pond was revealed to me. I took up my palette. Since that time, I have scarcely had any other model. Since 1966, Monet's house and gardens have been lovingly restored by the Academy of Fine Arts and the Claude Monet Foundation. Normandy has always been known for its pastoral, rolling farmland. Even the cows, which can be recognized by the circular markings around their eyes, have been bred from 3 local species to produce high-quality meat and milk. Nearly half the dairy output of France, including the country's most popular cheese, Camembert, comes from Normandy. Yet, oddly enough, it is the only region of France that produces no wine. With its extended coastline, Normandy has excellent seafood. Many restaurants specialize in delicacies ranging from oysters and scallops to shrimp, cod, clams, and, of course, mussels. The tranquility of Normandy was disrupted again by the onslaught of conflict in the middle of the 20th century. Nearly 900 years after the Norman invasion of William the Conqueror, the Second World War spread like a plague across Europe. Brigitte de Kergolay was in her early 20s when the German army arrived at her home in Canisy.
And we saw a German crossing the yard and walking in the main front door. We were terrified and horrified especially. Not so much terrified as horrified. We couldn't imagine that something like that would happen to Canisy. That someone uninvited, that we considered as an enemy, was walking into our house without asking permission or anything. It was really, for us, it was dreadful. And from that second on, I learned hatred.
For my grandfather, who had been fighting the Germans for 4 years during the First World War, which was a terrible, horrible war, the humiliation of having those enemies occupying his chateau was such that although he could speak German, because it was part of the education in the family to speak German, English, and French, he didn't want to speak to them. And so he was using my aunt, Brigitte, who was 20 years old, as the interpret.
As war raged throughout the continent of Europe, once again, Normandy had become a battleground. Once again, its geography would play a vital role in Normandy's destiny. Once again, the fate of the world would be determined by an invasion at Normandy's shores. On the morning of June 6, 1944, just before daybreak, the largest military operation in history took place along the Normandy coast, an invasion that became known as D-Day. 2 floating harbors were devised by the Allies that enabled large quantities of supplies and machinery to be unloaded quickly from ships and transported to the front. Sections of Port Winston remain today at the seaside resort of Arromanches. At Longnes-sur-Mer, massive artillery pieces are still anchored in their huge concrete emplacements overlooking the artificial harbor. On clear days, Bayeux Cathedral can be seen from the bunkers at Longnes-sur-Mer 5 miles away. Bayeux, which is home to William the Conqueror's now famous tapestry, was among the first towns in France to be liberated by the D-Day invasion. Down the coast rise the palisades of Pointe du Hoc, where the American 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled 100-foot cliffs to seize German artillery aimed at the American landing forces at Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. Pointe du Hoc exists today much as the Rangers left it, a battle-scarred, now grass-covered moonscape overlooking the English Channel. A powerful reminder of the enormous scale of the Battle of Normandy. But there is no greater memorial to the events of June 6, 1944, than the American cemetery at Omaha Beach. For this was the site of the bloodiest fighting of D-Day. As one writer put it, for many men, their first day of combat was also their last. Here, the elegant simplicity of the white markers enhances the impact of the memorial, where all the graves face in the same direction, toward America, toward home. William Zinsser summarized the poignancy of the cemetery when he wrote, "To visit the 9,386 American graves at Omaha Beach is to feel oneself in the presence of something done right." As Zinsser expresses so eloquently, the whole place has a sense of elevation, for this is landscape architecture distilled to its purest elements: earth, sea, and sky. Shortly after the invasion of Normandy, Brigitte de Kergolay returned to her castle at Canisy. Though severely damaged, the chateau had survived the onslaught of battle. For Brigitte, it represented hope for the future, but soon she would get another surprise.
The general commanding here was General Bradley, and they told General Bradley, that's a very special occasion, you must do something and be there for that occasion. And General Bradley said, it mustn't last too long, but I'll come at one time somehow. They made a birthday cake for me, and that was the most marvelous birthday cake I ever had in my life.
I don't know who was hosting who, but, but anyway, it's a beautiful little local story. You know, war there are lots of horrible things, and are quite often little details, little things like that are profoundly human and beautiful.
For nearly a week after the invasion of Normandy, the city of Caen continued to burn. Once the proud home of William the Conqueror, the town was rebuilt, and on the 6th of June 1988, the Memorial for Peace was opened by French President François Mitterrand.
The memorial was created in 1988 with the idea of trying to remind what happened during the Second World War, and especially on the Languedoc beaches, but also to try to make the visitors understand that human rights and peace are fragile, and it is important for each of us to preserve it.
Separated into 6 specific areas, combined with gardens and a gallery dedicated to Nobel Peace Prize winners, the Memorial of Caen has become an observatory of peace in perpetual metamorphosis as world events evolve.
As I move down, you can see here it starts off light, and then as you go along, it goes further on, it goes darker and darker, which is trying to show all the events leading to the Second World War. As you see here, we have the white walls. Further on down, it goes grey, and further down, darker and darker and darker as you follow down the circuit.
On September 12, 2001, at the Memorial of Caen, the flags of the United States and France flew at half-mast. And on September 14th, officials from every town along the Normandy coast stood at attention at the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach to observe 3 minutes of silence, followed by the playing of taps in tribute to those who lost their lives in terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001. Afterwards, a single wreath was anonymously placed at the base of the bronze statue symbolizing the spirit of American youth. Across the banner were written 4 words, words that were profound in their simplicity. We have not forgotten. For nearly 10 centuries, almost 1,000 years, the Chateau of Canisy has endured. It survives proudly within a region of France that has witnessed a procession of people and events that have altered the pages of history. And it has been a participant in that parade. The spirits of time are its chronicle. They are its legacy. As someone once wrote, "The past is no ghost at this banquet. Rather, it sits at the head of the table."
And the ghosts of Canisy are the most faithful inhabitants that you can imagine, because they exist since the creation of Canisy, since the first stones. They were already ghosts, and there have been those ghosts ever since.
The landscape of Normandy and other regions of France is dotted with magnificent, grandiose chateaux, and each has its own story to tell. But the Chateau of Canisy is unique. The branches of the Kergolay family tree are vast. 4 generations of Kergolays occupied the chateau during the 20th century, constantly renovating and restoring the property. Now, as the 21st century unfolds, Count Denis de Kergolay, who inherited the castle in 1977, continues the tradition.
I want to prove that a chateau can respect the past, but is open to the modern world, that it has a way to be useful in the modern world. And the way to be useful is that you invite people to stay in the chateau and in a way, to experience the chateau life. But you don't do it only in a commercial way.
The concept is simple, but the task is complex. To create a living, breathing environment where people can surround themselves with history as they experience the comforts and hospitality of modern-day living. A place dedicated to the interchange of ideas. A place of intellectual stimulation and thought. Yet a place where a sense of the past can be absorbed.
When people are here, they have a link with the past. And so it has an influence on them that is positive. And this is not just imagination, this is real.
Each bedroom and bathroom has been carefully appointed to represent a different period in history, each filled with antiques of their own particular era. At the north end of the chateau, a billiard room has been added. There is a small theater which can be utilized for plays or concerts. The theater is located within a large conference facility, so that it can be adapted for use in corporate presentations. And with a disco located under the original 11th century North Tower, who can begin to predict how the next 1,000 years will further change the property?
I think that sometimes our relationships between you, the Americans, and us, the French people, are very of mutual benefits. Probably because we have the history that allows us to have a background for analysis, but also you as a pays neuf, a new country, there's so much energy in your country that it fascinates us, and we improve at the contact of you.
Normandy is a place where people seek the heritage of the heroes who preceded them. Family, friends, neighbors, but heroes, one and all. Normandy is a place to which people are once again drawn to experience the history of a region where their imprint is so indelibly woven in the fabric of world events and the legacies of their own lives. The Chateau of Canisy and its region of Normandy are indeed windows to the past, but they are also windows to the future, a future that will one day become a place in history.